Well, that's promising. I mean, we'll have to
Yeah.
see. You know how stuff can change around here quite rapidly.
Right,
But,
right.
At least it's.
A lot of things in the works, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, of course. Yeah, and then I mean, we're still sort of waiting to see what happens with the House reform.
Right.
I mean, the Senate has given indications that they're, looking at it and I think looking at some other legislation. Trying to implement that.
It's an immense
Are you able to kind of see how many people are on the line?
Yeah. Except for that one guy that got screwed. It's a small geographic footprint. We're talking like 5 square miles. Oh yeah, yeah. Just like I'm in the bottom right corner of the big island. It's really small. It's just that most people think Hawaii and all people. Oh yeah, it's the biggest island in the world. Very southern southwest island. And I'm like, well, we're talking all said done, 4,000 people out of a population of approximately 1,000. And
Jerry was acting.
most impacts things like is actually air quality, not the water. Methane gas that's produced, and you have CO2 mixes with water, you get sulfuric acid, and you're breathing that in. So that and another concept called LAZE, scientifically is called LAZE, locally called Kelly's hair. Kelly's hair is like, think of flash shards of this long, really thin hair follicle. And it shattered into the and so,
Very nice to meet you.
no, I get this, thank you. How you doing, sir? Good, I'm awesome. Oh yeah,
So are we going to carry on that tradition?
There's another system where that might yes, yes. And that's another thing that's I think that was right. And you know, I caused they had a rare come up and they had a repeater. No one pushed it out. It wasn't, I think it was like really 5 second delay. You know, and some of the whole campus knew, and it wasn't literally 3 minutes later. Oh, yeah.
He was talking and I was looking up really. No. I've been elected involuntarily. Yeah, all the time.
Which brings together professionals across government.
I can make magic, I can make happen, you know. I've been reading up on GAO. So I read about that, read up what so you guys are going on financially. So I was definitely
okay, and there's a hearing. No, so that came out so it came out in 2016, and that was kind of purposely planned up so that's kind of how do you do Thank you. I'll be in touch.
I'm just, trying to figure out what to do.
Don't forget.
Okay, super. Thanks.
They'll ask me something and I don't know anything about it. 6 months and I do that.
I know your mouth.
Oh, it's okay. Oh, great. Yes. How are you?
Good. Actually, just shook her leg.
Yeah, okay.
I used to be, so the IRS was fine for me because explain it to him. He said to me, "You're coming to a meeting where I have to see if I'm going to go back." So I had to go meet with the CFO and a couple of senior people, and basically he told them to reconsider, and they turned around and said, I'm like,
How'd that work out? Okay.
it worked out okay. They had unfortunately not had full information. And I walked in knowing it. So
That helps.
The IRS does so much.
One or two.
How long have you been there?
Oh gosh, well, I've been in this work for about 4 or 5 years, but this house for 3 years.
Anything going well?
Well, I mean, when I started, I
Good to see you too. It's so saying that the days are long and the years are short.
yeah, I think you're right.
I was here
Yeah, no, my doctor is there pretty much looking at this brother.
How much has changed, just because of today, it's just like,
Yeah, he's bringing
we've got disclaimers in every place you look.
yeah.
There's very few agencies where there's some kind of hostility. Well, I don't know if some of the citizens, citizens groups that, I always, IRS have a little bit of hesitation. There's people that actually want to shoot IRS.
Yeah, I mean, we do Treasury and Secretary, auditor employees, agents, etc. And they're out, so that's something that we monitor.
Shall we? Hi everyone, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for making the trek downtown. I know traffic was a bit hairy in some parts, but I really appreciate you coming down to fill up before heading out to the parade. We are delighted today to welcome Tom Brandt to the Government Analytics Breakfast Forum. We host this forum along with REI Systems as a way to bring together professionals and academia and students and members of the private sector together to talk about different ways that the public sector is using analytics to address meaningful challenges. Our speaker will present for approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll have some discussions, and I will let our speaker determine if he wants to take questions throughout or if he prefers that you wait until the end. But regardless, we very much hope that this event is a discussion to really kind of think about some of the actual challenges that using analytics presents and how we can address those. We encourage you to tweet about the event if you so choose. There are some instructions up here for logging onto the Wi-Fi, but otherwise this is somewhat of a dead space in terms of cell service. But if you're able to tweet, you can use the hashtag #GabForum. And please note that a recording of the event will be posted to both the JHU and REI websites about 24 hours after the event. So if you have colleagues that are interested, you can share the link with them, or you can just rewatch it again if you missed something. Once again, we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be here and hope you enjoy the presentation. And with that, I will let my colleague, Jeff Myers from REI Systems, introduce our speaker.
Thanks very much for coming. I found it fascinating talking with a number of you this morning because we've got folks who are physicists from FEMA, from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, of course from several financial agencies. And that's actually a lot of the purpose of this, to give people a chance to get to know other folks tackling similar problems in different agencies in hopes that they'll share ideas and share ways to kind of support each other and find things that will help solve problems that are often not unique to one government agency. I'm really pleased to be here in the analytics space, and in fact, in particular, a very brief plug for REI. We're really proud of our client, the Health Resources and Services Administration. Some of the work that we've done with them on analytics has helped them make a significant difference in treatment in public health clinics of people with depression. And in fact, for that work, they recently were the winner out of more than 100 nominees for the ACT-IAC Igniting Innovation Award. So there is real innovation happening in government with analytics in a variety of different agencies. And REI is pleased to be a part of and a contributor to that. I'm really proud and pleased to be able to introduce Tom, because I've known Tom for more than 20 years, and he's been involved in the IRS for many of those years, although occasionally he goes afield, whether it be to Arizona or to Paris. But Tom has been involved in measuring, management, understanding of data about performance and of risk. And so he's actually one of the kind of the deepest experts I can think of in this field. And I'm pleased that he's able to come and share his thoughts and ideas with you. I asked Tom a few minutes ago, and Tom is happy to take your questions throughout the presentation. And if none of you come up with questions, I told Tom I would come up with questions for him. What I did not mention is that it's perfectly fair game for either him or for me to ask you questions, because there may be a number of instances where you've got experience with something, and perhaps Tom does not and is not able to answer the question. So we're hoping that it will be a participative discussion. Two last kind of housekeeping measures. We take a hiatus from these analytics breakfast forums over the summer because a lot of folks are on vacation, and also school is not so often in session. So July and August are going to be off. We're going to start again in October, and the event tentatively in October is going to be use of analytics to combat the opioid crisis. We think we'll have folks from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, as well as a chief data officer from the Department of Health and Human Services. And one of the audience members here today said, well, hey, I think we could do something really interesting with blockchain and an ability to track pills and volumes of pills. So we may have someone here who today volunteered to help serve on the panel in October, and you might be interested in hearing from him. But with no further ado, let me introduce Tom. And Tom, we're glad to have you.
Well, Jeff, thanks very much for that invitation, and thanks really for the opportunity to be here today. And thanks to all of you for showing up this morning. I assume you've got somebody saving your space on the parade route. The IRS headquarters, of course, is right along Constitution Avenue, and so this morning as I was driving into the office, that was about 6:30. There are people already lined up. So it looks like there's going to be quite a crowd out there today, but I think it's obviously an exciting time for the city in DC today. But thank you for joining us today. Today, you know, my plan today, when I looked back at what I told Jeff I thought I could cover, I looked back at that and preparing for the presentation, I said, gosh, well, any one of those topics could actually be a full presentation. So I think we're going to touch on a number of the topics and probably do a deeper dive on a couple of areas. But what I want to just preface my remarks to you today is that this isn't going to be a deep dive on specific analytics methods, and it's not going to be a deep dive on enterprise risk management. But what I'm hoping it does is give you some insight to where there are connections between analytics and ERM, and also some insights into how the IRS's approach to ERM has leveraged analytics, and I think, again, how analytics can have a role. And so for those of you who are ERM practitioners, perhaps this will give you some insight and some examples of how we can apply analytics in our work with ERM. And then for those of you who are analytics experts and practitioners, perhaps some ideas on how you can partner with or engage with the ERM program within your respective organizations with some ideas and some ways on how your expertise can actually help the objectives of ERM. In terms of how my remarks or presentation today are going to be organized, I do want to provide you with a little bit of context on IRS. So I'll start with just a little bit of background on IRS. I'll talk a little bit about analytics and its approach with regards to risk management. I thought it would be helpful too to spend a little bit of time talking about key risk indicators and sharing with you, I think, some of the challenges and opportunities that we've had at the IRS in seeking to utilize key risk indicators. And then, of course, as Jeff indicated, time for questions throughout, or certainly at the end. So if there's something that catches your eye or that you'd like a bit more detail on during the course of my presentation today, please feel free to raise your hand. So in terms of background for the IRS's Enterprise Risk Management Program, our program has been in place since 2014. We're actually in the process right now of conducting our 5th Enterprise Risk Assessment. So it's kind of hard to believe that we're already sort of 5 years into ERM at the IRS. We did base our approach on the COSO framework and looking really across the range of leading industry practices. But our primary intention for putting in place ERM was really to give the organization, as I've noted here, a common framework, enterprise-wide, on how we can best capture, report, and address top risks to the IRS. And I just wanted to share with you sort of what our governance and operating model is. So you can see that The ERM sort of is led at the top from our IRS commissioner. We have an executive risk committee that I chair, and then with our 2 deputy commissioners, and then a rotating set of other executives, and then a risk working group, which is comprised of senior level staff from all of the units within the IRS. Is our governance model, and then our operating model is certainly myself as the chief risk officer. I have a staff of 3 senior risk advisors that support me. We have ERM liaisons in all of the units at the IRS, and then we're supported in that work by other partners, certainly our research organization, IT organization, human capital, et cetera, and then work that we've done to train managers and analysts throughout the IRS on ERM. That gives you a little bit of context about our approach, and then in terms of where is the chief risk officer placed within the IRS, you can see that I report up through the Deputy Commissioner of Operations Support, but I also do have a direct reporting line to the IRS Commissioner, and I think that really is critical in terms of a risk management program, is having that access to the top leader in the organization, because I think that really is key in terms of the tone of the organization and the leadership view toward risk, and my ability to have access to the top leadership to share insight and or concerns about risk as necessary. So that gives you a little sense of what our structure is. And then I thought it would be helpful too, and we've tried to be really transparent in our risk management program at the IRS, and so you'll see throughout today that I share a number of examples. I think it's obviously good to talk about the approach, but I know that for most audiences it's really more useful to be able to see some live examples. So you'll see throughout my presentation referencing specific results from the IRS's approach, and if there's something here that you'd like more detail on at some point, by all means, please reach out or follow up with me, and I can do that as well. These are IRS's top risks, but I bet you if you look at these and from your respective organizations, there are probably several on here that could fall into a category as sort of top risk for your organization. I think across government we are challenged with aging technology infrastructure. Certainly cyber and data security is a key risk throughout government. I think all of us have been dealing with challenges around staffing shortages. For us, it's been a real, I think, critical area of focus for us is to be able to provide secure access to the services that we are trying to make available to taxpayers, and then an additional risk that actually was added to our enterprise risk list last summer as a result of last year's risk assessment was data breaches at external entities. We had actually just begun to do some work around identifying sort of the exposure in that area for the IRS, and then of course many of you will recall there was the Equifax incident last summer. So that risk kind of manifested much more quickly than we anticipated, and IRS had a related risk event to that. But we had at least identified that as a top risk and begun to do some consideration of risk exposure. And so just wanted to share that again for some context around what are some of the top risks that the IRS has identified and that we're working to address through our program. We also just released our most current strategic plan covering FY18 through 22, so this just came out a couple of weeks ago. I thought it would be helpful to just mention this today because you'll note that one of the 6 priority goals for the IRS is to advance data, access, usability, and analytics. And you can see some of the supporting objectives in this area is to update our data collection and retrieval capabilities to faster process information or provide faster access to information, improving our analytical tools and data competencies, and then emphasizing again the use of data analytics to select high priority work. And so as we've dealt with a reduction in staff and reduction in resources, it really is essential for us to look at improving the way in which we identify the most critical and most important work for the IRS. So I think what this just demonstrates is a recognition of how key data and analytics is to the IRS's future. And again, last item here on context. I also wanted to share with you the IRS's risk appetite statement. And again, for those of you wondering, you're asking, well, what's a risk appetite statement? Well, whether you have a written risk appetite statement or an unwritten risk appetite statement, organizations all have some level of risk appetite. It really is just the amount of risk that your leadership team is willing to take in pursuit of its objectives. And that can vary depending on the type of objective And organizations have a whole range of approaches to doing risk appetite statements. They can be very detailed by objectives, by risk area, or as you see here, our approach has been to start with a more overarching risk appetite statement, and then our intentions are over time to look at areas where we can make this, I think more detailed. But what you'll note here is that we just acknowledge that, of course, any organization, and particularly IRS, we have to accept risk and in working to achieve our mission, but that we do use thoughtful analysis to determine the level of risk that we're willing to accept. And there are specific areas where we are going to be especially attuned or sensitive to trying to avoid, prevent, or mitigate risk exposure. And those examples include administering the tax law fairly and with integrity, protecting taxpayer rights, safeguarding taxpayer data, etc. And then also a critical point here is that this doesn't work unless every employee in the organization supports risk management. So we do want to emphasize that every employee does have a role in helping to support the identification and management of risk. So I think just by sharing that background, you can see that sort of the emphasis on data and analytics flows through our strategic priorities. It's reflected in our risk appetite. And then you'll see how it is integrated into our overall approach to enterprise risk management at the IRS. So I wanted to just also share in terms of our approach to operationalizing risk management at the IRS. We recognized in setting up our ERM program that we obviously needed to have an approach and a structure that worked for the IRS overall, but that was only going to work if every unit within the IRS also had in place a set of procedures and processes to identify and manage their top risks. So we developed a set of operationalization standards around risk management. This reflects the set of standards that we have in place at the IRS, and obviously this shouldn't look unfamiliar to you because it is very similar to the risk management cycle in the GAO report, and also similar to what's reflected in the ERM playbook around some of the different components of the cycle around risk management. But I think what I also wanted to share with you today as well is looking at, so given the specific components of risk management, how has IRS, Jeff, go ahead.
I was going to ask, in some cases people think about mission risk. So for the IRS,
Yes.
do we collect all of the tax obligations that are due?
Yep.
And then they think about security risks, like does some person hack into the IRS's database and steal personally identifiable information? And I recognize that I guess my question is, are you dealing kind of through these structures with both types of risks?
Yes.
Because I think some agencies really focus on one and not the other, or have different ways of dealing with the two. So are you dealing with kind of both mission risk and the kind of the security risk?
Yeah, I mean, the whole intention of ERM is to actually take a broad view of risk and to not just look at, say, an operational type risk, but to broaden your view and look at financial risk, strategic risk, risk around technology. And I'd say, looking at sort of the IRS experience, that's probably one of the critical elements that I think ERM has helped bring to the organization, is expanding the view of risk beyond sort of the operational risk, and certainly focus much more on what's the strategic risk, and also looking at what's reputational risk. And I think we do, and that's an area that we've tripped up on, I think, several times, unfortunately, the IRS, is reputational risk. Because we do probably have a tendency to think very specifically around what's the operational risk around achieving program objectives, and not always thinking through what's perhaps the reputational risk associated with some of the decisions. So a key expectation, or a key sort of desire of ERM programs, is to broaden an organization's view of risk, and to look at that across sort of the whole spectrum.
So you're using the same structure to address all of the different types of
Yeah,
risks.
so that model can help support, both the identification of top risk to the IRS, which is really looks at the approach we take for our enterprise risk assessment, which results in that list of top risk to the IRS. But then this also can be used at the program level, at a process level. I mean, it really does lend itself to risk identification at different levels of the organization. The distinction is, what's the output, and at what level of the organization are you identifying risk? My office organizes it at the enterprise level, but then we also have unit level risk assessments, program level risk assessments, and process level risk assessment. I think, Doug, were you done?
No, I think I answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, good. Any other questions? Yes.
So Tom, you presented a risk appetite statement as overarching statement. do you also have a risk appetite statement for each of the risks in your risk profile? Because it appears that sometimes I read about, writing, coming up with a statement,
Yeah.
just like you have it, but also I've been told it's better to have a risk profile, and then for each of the risks, through your RMC council, the council, you determine the risk appetite for each of those. So sometimes I'm wondering which is it, which is the best way to go, or do you have to do both?
I would say that you need to tailor it to what's going to work in your organization. If you look at sort of a range of risk appetite statements across the organizations, you will see some that are very detailed, and they express risk appetite by different types of risks. And then you also have examples like ours, which is more of an overarching risk appetite statement. We did, when we first established our ERM program back in 2014, and we were looking at sort of models towards ERM, we saw most of those did reference the importance of having a risk appetite statement. So we did early on begin doing some work around establishing risk appetite, but we found it was really too soon. We needed to actually have a couple of years of experience in implementing ERM and getting a better understanding across the organization around really what was our risk appetite in a number of these areas. And part of that came out through the risk assessment process and the identification of top risks, the deliberation with our executive risk committee. That made it possible for us about 3.5 years in to then actually engage in a discussion around, well, what are those areas where we are most sensitive to risk, and really what is the reflection of our overall attitude toward risk. So I think, again, it does depend on the nature of your organization. It also depends on your objectives. So, depending on your mission and the key responsibilities you have, you may want to have a risk appetite statement that provides maybe more detail around your operational areas, particularly if you're involved in something where risk management is, I think, essential to the operations if you're dealing with perhaps security or health or other matters where you probably want to more clearly articulate what is your the amount of tolerance you have for risk. I think a question there as well.
Yes, it's kind of corollary. I'm Jerry White with FEMA, and so I'm trying to think. So far we've spoken more on the strategic and or kind of like day-to-day operational level.
Yeah.
Whereas with my agency, there are times where it's like life, security and safety. That's it. We don't care about anything else, other than saving people and from the particular impact site. But I'm trying to think, as we move from a response phase to a disaster to more of a recovery phase, where the recovery phase, will give you an idea, the typical disaster response is 3 to 6 months. Recovery is like 10 years. So I can see this applying on the recovery side, but I'm trying to think, how would I apply something like this on the response side where your first parameter is just life, safety, and security?
Well, I think it really is looking at what's the risk of the ability of FEMA to actually deliver on those objectives. So what are the risks to your capability to be able to respond to an event or a disaster when it occurs?
Well, see, that's,
right?
That's why I bring this up, is because as an agency, we have, if you will, I don't want to put the glib, but we don't have any skin in the game in the sense that we are the puppet master. We kind of ask everybody, hey, bring what you have to the table and we'll see what we can use it, in the big picture of things. But we as an agency, we have minimal staff, but we have a lot of the coordination. So, but when Congress asks us, are we better prepared to respond to a disaster, I'm like, it depends.
Well, I think what I'll get to in a little bit too here, though, is just some overall techniques and ways that organizations can assess sort of what is their overall readiness and capability to carry out their objectives. So, think about scenario planning, right, or scenario analysis. So I'm sure that's an area that FEMA does do work, is looking at different scenarios of different types of disasters that could occur and how could FEMA respond. For example, if there were 2 events, as we experienced last summer, where you had some, hurricanes that quickly followed upon one another, what's the capacity of FEMA to respond, and identifying what are some of the risks. I think looking across your operation in terms of your operations, how you organize staff to support and bring people on board, supply chains. So I think there's a number of areas where an ERM approach can actually help assess what is the overall ability or capability of the organization to actually carry out its objectives. Yeah.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
I'm a finance professor here at Johns Hopkins Carey Business School, and I'm trying to understand what I should, teach, in class, right? And I know the IRS collects a lot of money, and I don't think anyone's going to hack and take your money. So that's a risk that maybe an investment bank has or a commercial bank. But that's probably not the risk that you guys have, because you probably have that clamped down. The other question I have is probably more on the data side, right? Because you have all this very sensitive data on individuals and corporations. Now, what are your thoughts on, there is some talk about blockchains and it's supposed to be more secure and all this other stuff, right? I mean, have you evaluated that technology? Have you come to any, I know it's early stages there, but I mean, are you in discussions about potentially using something like that?
Well, let me say a couple things. First of all, refund fraud is a significant challenge for the IRS.
Okay.
So partly because there is so much information out there on all of us, that it is, I think, a continuing challenge to authenticate that we are dealing with a legitimate taxpayer and not a criminal who has enough information to authenticate as you, the taxpayer. So that is an area that the IRS, again, it is on on our risk register. It is something that IRS has partnered with financial institutions and tax preparation, the tax preparer industry and state tax administrations to collectively work at solving that particular problem. And clearly the data side of that, that is, I think one of our top areas of concern is making sure that we are securing all of the information that we compile to operate the tax system in the United States. So obviously that is a top risk. Blockchain is one of the areas that we've identified as an emerging risk and an emerging opportunity. It is something that the organization is looking at from the operational standpoint in terms of how might that just affect the tax system in the way in which the IRS administers tax, but then also what are some of the opportunities of how IRS could leverage blockchain and trying to reduce some of the risks in these areas. But I'd say we're in the early stages of that, but that certainly is among some of those areas of risk and opportunity that we've identified as trends that we need to be paying attention to and looking at what are those opportunities for us to apply. Okay, good questions. So getting back to sort of our overall approach to ERM and where analytics sort of comes into play here, I wanted to share this just because if you look at sort of some of the different components to risk identification and risk response and sort of risk management, you can then see where there's opportunities to apply analytics. This is actually the set of standards that we put in place at IRS and basically set the expectation that all of the units within the IRS needed to put in place processes to accomplish these standards. So we didn't prescribe a one-size-fits-all approach for all of our units because the size and the variety of units within the IRS, an organization of 25,000 employees spread out across the country, and then another unit that's 3,000 employees and largely centered in particular areas and various organizational structures. We recognize that it made more sense to agree on a set of standards and then allow the units to develop their approach to risk management in a way that worked best given their structure. But we put in place the set of standards for all of the units to follow, and then to sort of gauge how we're doing, we have conducted a series of self-assessments with each of the units on how they're doing against these standards. We've established and conducted a peer review to also look at that, and then we most recently did an executive survey and in-depth interviews with all of our ERM liaisons to gauge how well we've done in operationalizing ERM at the IRS and where some of our opportunities are. I won't go into detail here on sort of each of these individual standards. You can have this is available for download after today's session, and you can certainly look at that in more depth. But in terms of what some of the opportunities are, in terms of where analytics can be applied throughout the model, certainly in the risk identification area, it's really, I think, a critical opportunity there to help organizations become aware, both internally and externally, of risks that might not otherwise be apparent, and of course, doing some external scans, looking at social media, etc. Other types of tools that can give you a sense of where there might be emerging risk is an area of opportunity for applying analytics. As you're assessing risk, you can certainly see some opportunities there around likelihood and impact of risk. This is something where IRS has done some work in predictive analytics and also using behavioral insights to actually understand how different programs, different processes, different approaches that the IRS is taking across our business operations, how taxpayers are likely to respond. That can give you a sense of sort of what are some of the risk areas, and also, I think, again, getting a better understanding of likelihood and impact. Did you have a question again, or no? Yes? Maybe?
Yes, I actually did.
Okay.
So I'm thinking a little bit about peer review and a little bit about kind of some of your analytic models. I'm thinking, you know, the IRS knows a lot about individuals, and to a certain extent is a little bit like a credit reporting agency for kind of individuals around the country. And it makes me wonder kind of on behalf of some of the other folks, you know, for example, let's say FEMA, the gentleman asked a question a moment ago. Someone's coming in to apply for an emergency disaster assistance, and you know the IRS knows that that person has a history of committing fraud with the IRS over and over again, and all of a sudden now they, along with 400 other legitimate people, are applying for a disaster loan from FEMA. Is there a way that the government is able to share information back and forth effectively? You know, and in that case, presumably it would have to be on a quite timely basis.
Yeah, well, you probably know that there's a law called 6103 that governs the IRS's use of taxpayer information, and we are very limited in our ability to actually disclose or share taxpayer information, and there actually are criminal implications if we improperly disclose taxpayer data. So we have to generally either get statutory authority to share taxpayer data with other agencies, or you know, I think it has to fall under some of the provisions within that particular law in terms of what we are able to share. So I think that while there may be opportunities, that then has to sort of work through the process for us to actually get the authority to disclose and share that information.
Could FEMA share the information with you and then have you say back, you know, we didn't say anything about these 400, but boy, that one person is a known fraudster?
Well, so without going into a lot of detail, there's you know, there was a provision passed a year or so ago that with regards to passports and the ability of the State Department to revoke passports for citizens that have you know, excessive tax debts. In order for that process to work, the State Department actually needs to have access to taxpayer information. You know, that has been authorized through the legislative process, and then we are, you know, established a mechanism with the State Department to actually be able to share the information necessary for them to be able to make those determinations. So there are examples where other agencies and Congress have identified where taxpayer information can help in supporting some of the objectives of those organizations, but then we do have to work through the legislative process to actually give us the authority and to make sure that we are securing and appropriately protecting the information that we maintain at the IRS. Yes.
If I could follow up, I'm Dan Zabronsky with the Social Security Administration, and as probably the biggest of the benefit-paying agencies, we get a lot of data from various agencies, from Treasury, the do not pay list. We share arrival departure data we obtain from Homeland Security and from many other agencies, IRS. Mm-hmm. The big issue is it's very dispersed and decentralized, and we have to really do kind of one-offs to get this information. You know, the big challenge we've been trying to get is law enforcement data from the FBI, which we are barred from using, even though statutorily we're required to make sure, you know, we don't have convicted felons as representative payees or not paying people in certain programs that are convicted of crimes, yet we're barred from actually having the data. But so I think the big issue for us and probably most of the benefit-paying agencies is just the nature of the data exchanges is very uncoordinated, decentralized, and it's just a lot of work and a lot to keep track of, to have to go through. We probably get data from about 40 agencies, including all the states and local jurisdictions, and it's just a tremendous burden for the agency to obtain that information.
Well, the other element to that too is, I think, safeguarding and protecting the data. You know, as you begin sharing with other organizations, you still have an obligation to ensure that that data, once it is shared, is still being protected and secured. So, you know, it sort of does expand the risk a little bit. The more areas and places that you're sharing information, it does, I think, increase the opportunity or the potential for that information to be compromised. So, you know, I think particularly as it relates to taxpayer data, that's why we have to be, I think, so deliberate and careful in how we are engaging with various stakeholders to share data and make sure that any time where that's happening, that it is an authorized and appropriate use. But there are a number of examples, not only State Department, but also Department of Education, where we partner with them in providing information that can help with the financial aid process. And then, of course, a lot of information sharing with the Social Security Administration.
Do you include, as part of your process, third-party risk assessments? And as a corollary to that, do you then impose any requirements on them when you're sharing data with them?
Yeah, I mean, in order for us to share data with any entity outside the IRS, we have to go through a risk assessment process and actually look at what are the standards that they have in place to actually protect and secure the information that's shared with them. So for example, even when we're working with contractors or vendors and supporting us in some of our different business activities, before any taxpayer information can be shared, we have to conduct a very thorough risk assessment and make sure that they've got in place the appropriate protocols and securities around how they're maintaining, where they're maintaining, not intermingling taxpayer data with other data, et cetera. So that is an essential component before we even start the process of, and that's what sometimes takes so long too. And even though we may get authority to actually share data and taxpayer information, it can take a while to actually partner with these organizations and be clear around sort of what protections need to be in place before the data gets shared, and then give them the capability or the time to actually put that in place for us to test it and then make sure it is secure. Other questions? Good. Just a couple other areas, and I think this probably is very logical, looking at kind of, again, some of the different components of the risk management process and where, where data analytics can come into play. Certainly around, when we're looking at risk response and trying to better understand sort of what are some of those mitigations that, or where could you apply your resources in a way that would have the most effect on risk. And again, this is where something perhaps around some predictive analytics could come into play, and understanding if we apply resources here or to this particular process or program, how might that reduce the risk exposure. Clearly in risk reporting, as we're trying to establish, say, thresholds or some of our metrics, I think is an opportunity for us, and I'll get into a bit more in how analytics can apply in sort of risk monitoring and risk reporting. And then certainly around information and communication. And I think as the presenter last time here from was the DHS FEMA back in April, was sharing some examples of how you present information can actually influence or affect the receiver's view of risk. And so it's really important for you to think about how are you presenting and arraying information about your risks in a way that doesn't either confuse or sort of misrepresent the risk and certainly impact perception. And also presenting the risk information in a way that's digestible and understandable by different audiences. Again, I think at the last presentation in April, there was some discussion around a lot of good work and deep dives that were done from an analytical perspective on trying to identify different types of risk, but then putting all that information in front of the decision makers was just too much. So, trying to figure out how can you boil that down to some of the key points that can help inform decision making, but also not, I think, unduly direct or sort of complicate the ability of the decision makers to utilize that data. I did also want to just share with you some examples of some different analytical approaches that can be used to support risk identification and analysis. These are some examples of different types of approaches that we've been able to utilize at the IRS. Some of these, I think, clearly, again, the connection is quite logical. Starting out sort of with what we would term sort of the health check is something that IRS did in its first year of ERM implementation, is really doing a range of targeted interviews and workshops with internal and external stakeholders to quickly identify, at that point in time, what we saw as sort of the top risks impacting the IRS. That was a starting point for us. Other opportunities here, looking at crowdsourcing. How can we utilize the knowledge and the expertise of the entire IRS workforce in helping us get a sense of top risks and also get their input, for example, on external risks. Wargaming, gamification. This is something that a lot happens or can be done here, and particularly around cyber. So utilizing different types of experiences with executive teams and other key stakeholders on how do you respond when if a cyber attack occurs, and how might this particular response actually create other risk or create other exposure. And I think that can give good examples on how risk response, I think some of the benefits and challenges around risk response. When we look at scenario analysis, this is an area of, or a tool that we use quite extensively in implementing the Affordable Care Act at the IRS, looking at as different types of provisions were coming into play, how might taxpayers respond, what might be the types of questions that we're getting, what might be the phone traffic that gets generated, and using that to then identify sort of what might be some of the various scenarios we face and how would we respond. Another area here that I'll just mention in the interest of time is, obviously, external analytics is an area of work that is leveraged in a great way to support our strategic planning, and we do partner with our strategic planning office to look at what are some of those external risks. We've also partnered with other tax administrations, so we have organized a workshop earlier this year with about 36 different countries and their tax administrations to look at top risks that they'd identified and how do those compare to the top risks that the IRS is faced with. Internal analytics and the setting of targets, looking again across various components around, as you all understand, looking at people, process, technology, understanding sort of what are the implications in each of those areas around relationship to risk, and how do challenges in each of those areas create exposure across the different types of risks that the IRS is facing. And that also helps, I think, in determining mitigations. So in looking at those areas, what are the opportunities for IRS to further mitigate some of the top risks that we're facing? And then also what we sort of, I term here the mission, vision, value, and strategy deeper dive. That's really looking at the strategic goals, the supporting objectives. Underneath that, what are the organizational units and what are the objectives they have in place to support each of those goals? And then what are some of the resource requirements and dependencies that are necessary in order for us, for the IRS to achieve its mission? That can give you a sense of risks at each of those levels. So those are just, again, some examples, and again, not a deep dive, but again, just I think helping to sort of stir your thinking around what are some of the opportunities where analytics can be applied to an ERM program and the ERM activities. I also just wanted to mention, and certainly in the summary of what we were going to talk about today, or what I was going to talk about today, I did mention that I was going to reference the risk acceptance form and tool that the IRS has in place. This is something that was cited in the GAO report in 2016 that was looking at agency approaches to ERM. One of the areas that we identified early on was an area of exposure for us was that in relation to some of the more significant decisions that the IRS had made, and certainly because of turnover oftentimes, with attrition and decision makers leaving and changes in leadership, was being able to look back at key decisions that were made and understanding what risks were identified, what were the considerations that went into that decision, and also just putting in place a tool to actually help facilitate the consideration of different types of risks and the risk exposure to help facilitate that decision. So we created what we call the RAFT, and it does provide a mechanism for leadership, management in the organization to actually, I think, clearly articulate different types of risk associated with a decision, different parts of the organization, both upstream and downstream, that may be impacted by a risk, and then pulling into this specific analytics that can help, I think, better depict or better denote the risks that we may be accepting based on the options that are being given consideration. So this is something that's been really helpful for us at the leadership level and across the organization as a tool to help facilitate specific decisions and the consideration of risk. I see you have a question. Yep.
Yeah, the IRS, of course, relies heavily on voluntary compliance.
Yep.
And for a long time, as you say, reputational risk has been a big issue because if your reputation is damaged, people not comply as often.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking kind of the IRS is maybe a ways ahead of a number of other agencies in government. But given kind of the recent questions about Russian interference and trying to kind of make the questionable Americans' confidence in government in some ways, I wonder whether or not there are ways you could say, here are better ways, or here are the ways that we've both identified the risk and perhaps even we've estimated the potential impact of reputational damage that the IRS has done that some other folks in the room might learn from that perhaps, may similarly face a reputational risk but either not be aware of it or not understand how to measure it. How do you measure reputational risk, or especially the bad outcome?
Well, I think the IRS can, through some of our past experience, and then I think also just a little bit of scenario or situational analysis, we can assess our various stakeholders and understand what are their interests and how are they likely to respond to specific decisions that the IRS is making. I don't know, Jeff, if there's a way to specifically quantify. I mean, you look at sort of public attitudes, for example. There's the Roper survey, there's the Pew survey. There are surveys out there on public attitudes towards government, and particularly public attitudes towards the IRS. The IRS Oversight Board used to do a whole suite of metrics looking at taxpayer attitudes towards paying taxes, towards the IRS. The Oversight Board is no longer in operation, but our research organization has taken that on. Those are metrics that we look at from a strategic level, but also even from our risk program when we're doing our annual risk assessment, we do look at what's changing there. So how are public attitudes changing towards the IRS? As we went through, I think, some of the challenges in 2013 and 2014, we paid very close attention to what were the changing attitudes about fairness at the IRS and about the responsibility of all citizens to pay their taxes. So I think what I would probably just offer in that space is looking at what types of tools do you have in place to gauge sentiments of your customers and of taxpayers. The other piece to that too is monitoring social media. We do monitor, sort of what is happening in social media in terms, for example, during filing season. What are people saying about the filing process, about the timeliness of their refunds, about hold times? Because that can give us a really quick insight into areas where there might be a problem occurring. And today, everybody, the minute they're dissatisfied with something, they're tweeting, right? So if you're paying attention to that, that can give you an insight to where there might be a problem cropping up. And so I think that's an opportunity too, is what is the extent to which you're monitoring social media.
Let me follow up on that, I might, with an alternative point of view.
Sure.
There are those who say that there's no such thing as reputational risk.
Yeah.
Damage to reputation is an impact of some other risk, because if you didn't have the other risk, you'd never be talking about damage to reputation. Now, the impact on reputation has uncertainty, which you could call a risk, but that's true of any impact. So my question is, does the IRS have a particular point of view on reputation as a separate category of risk or not?
No, I think we link it with our strategic risk, but I think the way we look at it, Doug, is how are various stakeholders likely to respond to a particular decision, and then what are some of the mitigations that the IRS can take to actually reduce perhaps some of the reputational results that could occur because of particular decisions that the IRS makes. And we've got, as you know, a whole range of stakeholders, and in the last several years, I think we've given some of the challenges from a budget and staffing perspective and trying to balance resources to service and enforcement and implementing a range of legislative requirements, trying to understand how some of the various programmatic decisions might be perceived or reflected, or how they might impact various stakeholders, and then what are some of our opportunities to get ahead of where there might be reputational exposure by engaging early with those stakeholders, by making sure that we're reaching out and providing advance information around decisions that are being made, about initiatives. So I think it just gives an additional lens to consider the impact of some of those decisions. And so it's not necessarily its own category, but it's an area of awareness that as we're making decisions, we do want to be cognizant of how might this affect the reputation of key stakeholders who can affect the IRS, right?
So I have a question in regards to the analytics that you guys are using.
Sure.
What tools you find most useful? And then the follow-on question is, what is the current biggest challenge that if someone could solve, you'll be like, yay!
Well, let me start with the latter. I think the authentication challenge is the biggest issue that I think not only
isn't
IRS.
everyone under the Social Security numbers? Isn't that how they file their taxes, or EIN number?
Yeah, but the ability of fraudsters to get access to your Social Security number, it's not a secure piece of information anymore.
So that's a large problem.
Yes.
You are who you are. You say you are. That's the biggest challenge right now.
The IRS's ability to authenticate that the taxpayer, the person who's coming in to establish their online account, to apply for their refund, to get access to their tax information, our ability to actually authenticate that they are who they say they are and that they're not a fraudster trying to get access to information and then file a false refund, that probably is one of the biggest challenges that the IRS is facing. But then that's where a whole array of data analytics is being applied to look at where is that traffic coming from.
Exactly.
Like who are the, who is coming in? What are the IP addresses? What part of the world are they coming from? How does this, what is the pattern, right? So understanding the pattern of who's coming in and then how might that change.
But presumably you have that history of data, right? So you have these bad guys, right, and the good guys, and so you could machine learn and make a prediction whether this particular person who's asking for a refund is, a good or bad, person. Right?
That sort of goes into the whole realm of all of the filters that we identify. So as individuals file tax returns online and in paper, all of those get run through a set of filters to actually look at, are there any things that get flagged that say this could be actually a fraudulent return based on past experience, based on how it's filed, where it's filed, when it's filed, whether or not we've got a fraud indicator.
Exactly, but are you using machine learning there? Are you using like artificial intelligence in order to make predictions on each one of these?
Yeah, I can't get into, I'd say, a ton of detail on that, but that is an area that is being utilized in sort of our overall compliance approach, is how can we apply that type of capability to further enhance our overall fraud detection and identification of non-compliance. I think it's got some other questions.
Yeah, I'm Charlie Clark, Montgomery.
Oh, sure, yep.
Can you talk about use of data analytics in performance of the agency, for example, in detecting errors either by the taxpayer or by the agency?
Yeah, so the last piece, what I'm just going to get to, and I'll just, and I can, I think, cover that as I'm responding to your concern. The IRS measures everything, right? But yet, even though the IRS measures everything, and let me skip over to this, so key risk indicators. One of the things that we wanted to incorporate into our enterprise risk management program is not only the qualitative view of risk, but also a quantitative view of risk. So what are some of those top indicators that we should be monitoring that can give us some leading insight to where risks may be emerging, or where we want to monitor because we want to be careful that something is not getting outside of our risk appetite or sort of key thresholds. And so as we look across all of those top risks facing the IRS, trying to identify what are the metrics that we are monitoring or collecting that can give us insight into where there might be risk. So we measure the quality of almost all of our business processes at the IRS. So the quality of phone service, right? The quality of the information that's provided to taxpayers at walk-in sites. The quality of responses provided in correspondence with taxpayers, the quality of examinations. There's a review process to look at a sample, for example, of phone conversations with taxpayers, of casework that's completed, of our outreach, for example. So there's an extensive quality assurance and quality review process within the IRS. Those can help, I think, inform monitoring of risk, because obviously if your error rate's starting to go up significantly, or if you're seeing quality decline, you're going to want to ask questions to understand what may be behind that. But so I think, in that regard, that can be very helpful. And then certainly timeliness is something else you want to tie into that too, and understanding, is a backlog occurring in any of those processes. There's always going to be some level of backlog that would probably be acceptable, because you want to make sure you've got enough work in place for your workforce. But understanding sort of what's the point at which, if there's a backlog or a number of people waiting for service that continues to grow, that then should trigger a particular response for the organization. Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
Yep. Was there other? Yep.
Hi, I'm Jen Bachman with the Government Analytics Program. I was curious about how you monitor social media, because I think it's a great example of government responsiveness. And in particular, I was wondering if you use kind of a formal analytic approach, like a sentiment analysis, or if it's more informal and you're just kind of scanning to see if there are any common problems that pop up.
It's a range of both.
Okay.
So part of it is capability to look at sentiment analysis and just relying on services to give you a sense of what's trending, I think, overall. But then we also do look at specific social media posting. So look at what are, in our case, taxpayers posting during filing season, for example, to Twitter, to Facebook. What are they saying about the IRS? And in large part because that can oftentimes give us insight, particularly around what we find, particularly during filing season, what surprisingly people really like to post about is how quickly they get their refund. And so if you get a refund out really quickly, people tend to post for some reason that, wow, I submitted my tax return last week and my refund showed up 4 days later. But we can also get a sense if there's delays cropping up somewhere. So if folks are trying to get service on the phone line, or if they've made an appointment with a walk-in center and they've had some problem or experience, we can use that as well to sort of gauge. So it's a mix of both. It's looking in the aggregate across social media to understand sort of what's trending about the IRS overall, but then looking specifically at the types of posts and seeing what are people saying. So it's kind of a little bit of both. Yep.
Kind of curious in that regard. Do you cross-index multimedia? For example, you have a complaint in social media that your return's taking too long,
Yes.
but then you look at your phone bank to say, okay, how long is your interaction, but more importantly, what is the sentiment that your phone bank personnel are hearing?
Yeah.
Do you do something like
Oh,
that?
absolutely, yeah. And so I think you kind of have a range of metrics because you want to look at what are our own internal metrics telling us. So what are our hold times, right? What's the level of service that's being provided? Are we seeing customer complaints coming in through formal channels? Employees do have the ability to also flag if they're starting to get a range of questions that that seem unique or distinct to them. They have the ability to flag that and raise that in the organization to say, wait, we're getting a lot of questions around this particular issue and try to understand what's prompting that, for example, so you can pair that with what we might be seeing externally as well.
I think it was maybe something we've discovered or found at FEMA on occasion. I won't say it's consistent, but on occasion. Do you need to have the phone bank personnel slow down the conversation or slow down, stretch out the length of the interview? Not so much that they're passing information to the citizen, but they're listening to their story. And then consequently, basically, if you can vent, then you're happier, kind of.
Yeah, so I don't work in the phone operations of the IRS, but my sense would be that depending on the specific intention or purpose of the phone call, you do need to use a different approach. So if somebody is just calling in to understand, they have a question about, filling out their tax return, or they trying to get to call in and confirm their balance, that's a certain type of conversation. But if it's a taxpayer who's got, they owe significant debt, or they've gotten a letter about audit, that's probably a different type of conversation. So it really depends on why is the person calling you, and then that should really inform the type of conversation in the interaction that they're having with the phone assistant. So I think it really does need to vary based on the intention of the call. Question over here.
Hi, I'm Chris Daly. I'm the Director of Data Science at Global ISI.
Yes.
One of the things we do is try to fuse behavioral science with data science to try to overcome the weaknesses in each. And I was delighted to hear you mention how risk can be unintentionally misrepresented based on how would you present the same data in different ways. How do you take any a formal or quantitative approach to calculating how risk is perceived, and not just what actual risk is there, whether you're briefing an executive or the public?
Well, I'm just trying to think where the specific types of risk. So I know we can, when we look at within our business operations and trying to understand compliance risk, for example, and how are taxpayers likely to react to different interactions with the IRS. That's an area where we've done, I think, a good bit of work on applying behavioral insights, for example, to understand how will taxpayers react to different types of correspondence that we may share with taxpayers. So if we're telling somebody that they have a balance due, there's actually some work that was done within the last year where we have tried a number of different approaches to communicate with taxpayers around their tax obligations and in areas where they had past amounts due. And it was really interesting for us to see how different segments of the population would respond differently in terms of what information was put onto the notices, how that information was formatted, the use of color, the use of different graphics. So I think from just trying to understand in the area of compliance risk, there are ways for us to actually measure what the response is of taxpayers to how we communicate with them. But help me understand a bit more about what you're trying to get around the broader areas of risk.
Really anything in that area. I didn't have a specific area I wanted to go into,
Okay.
just that sort of quantitative assessment of a qualitative perception.
Yeah, well, I mean, another area too right now is IRS is obviously in the middle of implementing tax reform, and there's been a whole, wholesale change to the tax system. So we need to understand as well how are taxpayers likely to react, right, to those changes, and understanding what may we see in terms of taxpayer behaviors in the upcoming filing seasons, and how will that perhaps change the way in which IRS provides service, and the way in which our compliance operations are organized. Because, you know, for just as an example, the standard deduction, of course, was doubled, so we're anticipating that a lot fewer taxpayers are going to be itemizing information on their tax returns. So how is that going to affect, you know, what the processing of tax returns, the types of questions that people may have? What does that do to the compliance, you know, areas of potential non-compliance? If you've got a lot fewer people itemizing, does that reduce compliance risk on those types of returns? So, you know, that's an area where we can look at some past performance to predict future performance. And then there's other areas where some of the changes are a little bit less uncertain around how taxpayers are likely to respond, and some of that might be in the business arena. That's where I think we can apply, you know, some other mechanisms, and certainly apply some research methods to try to understand what might be some of the different scenarios of how taxpayers could respond to some of those changes in the tax code. So I think that's, again, trying to understand what are some of the risks operationally, business-wise, and procedurally in a significant initiative like that, where we have a range of opportunities to apply analytical tools and behavioral insights. I think I have another hand back. Or is that it? Okay. Jeff, how are we doing on time?
We've got 15 minutes.
Okay. All right, so what did I skip over here? I know, and so I shared a little bit about the raft. I won't go into great detail, but again, I do like to just give examples of some of the different tools that we have used at the IRS that may be of interest to other organizations as they're implementing ERM. IRS is form-based, so we do sort of organize ourselves around our culture, but we also did put in place a process and a tool to help elevate and to help assist with the elevation and escalation of risk, and help facilitate, I think, again, quick consideration of risks that the organization may be facing, and providing a mechanism to provide context around that, and also, again, to offer in or to add in measurements, analysis, et cetera, to help define and help support the consideration of risks at the IRS. So I just wanted to share this again as another example, but I won't go into great detail around it. I was going to spend just a few minutes, but I think we've touched on some of that today during the questions and answers already around challenges to applying analytics to ERM. But these are, I think, challenges in applying analytics overall. Certainly timeliness and availability of data. So when is the data available, and how quickly can we make it available to the organization to use? What's the format of that information, structure, et cetera, that creates challenges? Do we have the right resources and the right tools in place to help support analytics? What's our access to information? I think, Jeff, your question, there's a lot of data all over other agencies and other organizations. What's the ability of us to access that information even within the IRS across units? Relevancy of data. We collect a ton of data, but how much of it is relevant to the particular problem you're trying to solve? Do we have the right expertise? I talked earlier about presentation and communication, and how do you translate very complex information into outputs that can be easily understood and absorbable, right? Managing expectations, what data can and what data can't tell you. And then, again, something that could be an entire presentation itself is avoiding data and research bias. So, how do you make sure that you're not, engaging in sort of confirmation bias, and making sure that you're looking at an array of decision points, an array of data around particular risk, and not just that data that's confirming sort of what your initial expectation or thinking might be about risk exposure, or sort of the degree of risk that you're faced with. So, those are some, I think, relatively common challenges around analytics, and particularly I think they do apply in the ERM space. An approach that can sort of help, as you're looking through how to, I think, appropriately and effectively apply analytics. Again, I won't go into this in great detail, but I think it's important up front to really understand what is the problem you're trying to solve, and not just, let's go apply analytics and see what we find, but what is it we're really trying to understand, what's the problem we're trying to solve, and then again, thinking through what is the right type of analytics for the problem that you're trying to answer, or the hypothesis that you're trying to answer. So you're looking at understanding what happened, you're looking at understanding why it happened, and you're trying to look into the future, what might happen. or more importantly, prescriptive. What is it we might want to happen, and then what are some of the ways for us to help prompt that? And that's where perhaps behavioral insights can give you some information that can be actionable, is understanding what will likely prompt desired behaviors, and then how can we build that into our processes and our systems. Clearly understanding the audience that's going to be consuming the data. We've talked a little bit about that, how important it is to make that information and the output consumable. The importance of support. That's been critical for our program, at the IRS, is making sure that we partner with and have the support of the entire organization. And that's where the value add piece comes in. What is the value that ERM is adding? What's the value that analytics is adding to help the leadership make better decisions, to have a better insight into top risks, and really to avoid perhaps some of the downsides of risk. And I think what are the opportunities to more fully, leverage or realize the opportunities associated with risk. And then sort of the test and learn approach to the implement incrementally and iterate. Those can be some approaches that can help you, I think, move past some of those challenges of applying analytics to ERM or just applying analytics in general. And this session on key risk indicators could probably be its own segment altogether, and I touched on a little bit in the response here, but I think what I just wanted to emphasize here, this again, this any of you are familiar with sort of the SMART model and the importance of applying that to the identification of metrics. But why it's important is you do need to have a balance of qualitative and quantitative information to help inform the consideration of risk. And again, depending on your audience, some folks can manage and I think deliberate effectively with qualitative information. Some are going to be more comfortable and more attuned to using quantifiable information, and then I think there is sometimes a sweet spot. I think again where your qualitative and quantitative information complement each other and really help give you a clear picture of the risk itself, the exposure, and how effective perhaps your various mitigation strategies might be. I just again share some information that you can digest on your own, and certainly you can always reach out and if you've got questions or would like more detail around this, but different types of indicators that can be applied, particularly in a risk environment. Something that's not yet occurred, it is occurring, and you want to be able to quickly respond, and then lagging indicators, which are not necessarily as helpful because it typically tells you that event has already happened. So you kind of want to make sure you're looking at your indicators probably more from a leading indicator or escalation indicator viewpoint. Yep, question to that.
Hey, Tom, good question on, I know you guys have been doing this for the past 4 years or so.
Yeah.
Could you touch real quickly on some value added, indicators or outcomes from implementing ERM at the IRS?
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, we just held an ERM CPE for all of our executives at the IRS about a month ago. And we had probably about 2/3 of our executive team that joined for that particular session, and our acting commissioner kicked that off, and we had several of our executives sort of sharing their perspective and view on how ERM has helped the IRS, and the commissioner as well. So even the acting commissioner who's been at the IRS now for about 6 or 7 months or so, he opened up the session by commenting on how much the consideration of risk was being identified and raised and discussed across the leadership meetings that he was participating in. And even when we look at, for example, on tax reform, that was a critical component for IRS's deliberations with the Treasury Department on what is going to be necessary for IRS to successfully implement tax reform, is really understanding what are the risks. And so we have an executive steering committee in place at the IRS that's overseeing that particular process. But I'd say where some of the benefits have been is risk is now part of the conversation more naturally across our executive steering committees. As part of our business performance reviews that all of the units at the IRS have on a quarterly basis with their respective deputy commissioners, there is a standing discussion of both unit level risk as well as what each unit is doing to address enterprise risk. And then the other opportunity for us has been we've tied our enterprise risk into our budget and investment decision-making process at the IRS. So the identification and consideration of investments actually have to address or speak to how they will help address IRS's top enterprise risks, and those are weighted. That's given a pretty significant weight in that overall deliberation process is how will those investments help reduce risk exposure for the IRS. So I think those are some examples that I'd share. Got a question over here?
On that topic, how do you compare and contrast the different risk categories, especially when it pertains to how you apply budgets to the different risk categories?
Yeah, well, I think that's where you want to look a little bit around likelihood and impact, right? So what's the likelihood of the risk occurring, and if it were to occur, what's the impact? So, even in a period of reduced budget resources for the IRS, the impact of a cyber event would be so significant on the IRS that has always ranked extremely high in terms of our investments. But that's why I think if you look at the set of enterprise risks for the IRS, and certainly in our process for evaluating investments, we look at the extent to which they will address any of the enterprise risks, but more specifically the top 5 enterprise risks facing the IRS. So I think part of that is you want to also add to the equation, what are those top risks that, were they to occur, could have the most significant impact on the operations of the IRS? Question over here?
Morning, I'm Lynch Consultants, but we're working with Department of Veterans Affairs right now,
Yep.
implementing ERM practices.
Yep.
And the biggest challenge we have right now is once you've thought through the strategic thinking of how you're going to roll out processes and build the tools, is actually getting people to report risk, right? There's inherent culture of trying to keep them within your organization. So before we can even get to the analytical portion of it, we need to make sure the management even has the correct data. What are you doing within your organization to make sure you even know what your internal risks are? We've done a lot of talking about external risks, but what's internal within your organization?
Yeah, so the question for those online that may have not heard it, I think, is just how do you create that environment where information about risks is being readily shared, and how do we have insight into internal risk? Well, our enterprise risk assessment process starts with going to the business units and pulling in their risk registers. So all the units at the IRS maintain their own risk registers that identify top risks to each of those units. As part of our process, we pull all of those in, and then we look across all of the unit level risk registers to actually help inform enterprise risk. I think for us, the most critical factor in trying to facilitate willingness to share risk was our former Commissioner, John Koskinen. Whenever he met with employees, whenever he met with managers, and when he ever met with executives, he always said that the only way we're going to be able to fix the problem is for us to know about it. So we need to be able to share those risks, and we need to be considerate around how we react and how we respond when that information is shared, and make sure that we're following up. But his view also was that we are better off having identified those risks ourselves and begun to address them versus waiting for the risk to manifest or waiting for somebody else to point that risk out. So I think leadership can have a really critical role in creating an environment where people across the organization feel comfortable raising risk. And again, I know, in an environment where there can be a lot of scrutiny and I think oversight around organizations, that there can be some discomfort, I think, sometimes around sharing that. But again, I think the flip side of that is I still think you're better off having identified it yourself and started to do something about it versus waiting for it to, just manifest or for somebody else to point it out. Other questions? I think, the other thing I was just going to share about the KRIs, and there's probably more information than we can get here today, is even though we measure everything at the IRS, it seems, it was a challenge initially to try to get the organization to work with us in identifying key risk indicators. So what are those indicators that give us insight into the scale of the risk, whether or not our risk response is effective. So we were challenged in the first couple of years of really trying to put KRIs in place. We focused a lot on process, we focused on trying to explain what they were, and we kind of were spinning our wheels. So we decided last year, let's just start with something, right? Let's look across the suite of metrics that we have for all of these areas and that tie to the risks, and begin to identify metrics that at least begin to inform the discussion and the consideration of risk. So we stopped talking about key risk indicators and we just started talking about enterprise risk indicators and said, okay, what are some of those metrics that actually can help give you some insight into the risk? The scale of the risk, the importance of, you know, what our response is, et cetera. So here were just a couple of examples of some of the metrics that, you know, we've begun to compile and report around a few of our risks. Obviously, aging technology infrastructure is the top risk the IRS has faced. We're trying to understand that. Well, okay, well, what is the percentage of our hardware that's aged, and how current are we in terms of our software? You're looking at your critical staffing shortages. Obviously, you want to know what's your attrition rate. We also want to understand, well, how long does it take to actually hire people? And then importantly is what's the percentage of our workforce that's retirement eligible? I mean, as that number continues to grow, there's nothing more effective to put in front of our stakeholders or our leadership is to show that upward trend of retirement eligibility and how quickly that's coming at us to have people understand the nature of that risk. And then, you know, some more general indicators or opportunities to leverage the FEVS and trying to understand risks around employee engagement and morale. And I shared some illustrations of how some of these metrics are shared and reported. So, you know, again, this is illustrative, but an example around you know, percentage of aged hardware. But again, what this also does is say, okay, well, that's overall, but I want to understand what makes that number up. So yeah, you're at 52%, you know, illustratively here of your hardware's aged. Well, how do you break that out? What type, you know, what type of hardware is aged? You're breaking out the categories of hardware. So that's just an example where you want to do a little bit of a deeper dive behind your metric to understand, you know, the severity of the risk in different categories. If we were looking at, you know, servers, et cetera, having a much higher percentage of the total, then the nature of that risk probably would be much more significant versus where we see in this example, you know, with the majority of the aged hardware being laptops, desktops, printers, and scanners, that probably is a little bit less risky than it being servers, for example. I had mentioned to you around, you know, staffing. You know, again, just an example of, you know, that shows pretty, I think, clearly the growing risk of departing workforce. But then also importantly is looking at, okay, well, one of our primary mitigations is hiring. Well, how good are we doing at actually keeping the people we hire? And if you're seeing increasing departure of your new recruits in their first couple of years at the agency, well, then that probably tells you that there's a risk that we need to be looking at there and looking at what are some of the additional mitigations that could be put in place. So this is just an example of how we're using different metrics to inform our deliberations and consideration of risk at the IRS. And these are some of the tools that I've referenced today. The only one I didn't mention is the Enterprise Risk Channel, which is you know, a channel that we have in place at the IRS overall that is available for anybody at the IRS to actually share or raise a risk confidentially to my office if for some reason existing channels they're either not comfortable or existing channels aren't working. It's just, you know, again, some examples of different tools we've used. And then the last item I wanted to share, because I do get questions about this quite a bit, is sort of what's the overall long-term view the IRS has put in place around its objectives or goals for ERM. We looked at a number of different models, capability models, maturity models for ERM, COSO, and then certainly some in the playbook and other examples, and then developed one again that fits the structure and the organization of the IRS to try to set the course that we wanted to achieve with implementation of ERM at the IRS. And I'd say that, you know, I think my sense is that we're somewhere in the integrated, somewhere between integrated and sustaining at the IRS with our ERM program. But you know, you can move backwards on this capability model, particularly I think sometimes with changes in leadership, depending on tone at the top, and certainly you know, if there's a significant change in our operations that could affect this model. But I shared this with you because I do get questions a lot around what's sort of the guide stone that you set in place for establishing ERM at your organization. This is just an example of what we've done at the IRS. So I hope that this has given you some insight into one agency's approach to ERM in terms of how and where there's opportunities to apply analytics. There is some additional information in the back of the presentation giving you more detail around the top risks facing the IRS. And again, if you do have questions at any point in time, by all means, please feel free to reach out to me either today or afterwards.
And I reserve the last question, which I would like to make a standard. For those of you who in the audience are interested, I wonder, Tom, if you could tell briefly kind of how your career path ended up in a senior role where you're using analytics, because other people might want to follow your path.
Yeah. So I've been with the IRS for about 24 years. I did, as Jeff mentioned, as you saw in my bio, I left a couple of times to go, dabble in local government and then to actually have an opportunity to work with an organization overseas that looks, helps serve tax administrations throughout the world. But I, got my start in the strategic planning and budget office at the IRS, and of course, there's a lot of and helping facilitate the external scanning of top risk to the IRS early on in my career. So that's where we had opportunities, I think, then to utilize analytical tools to really identify some of the emerging trends, right, and issues affecting the IRS. And moved into our large business and international division and was responsible for performance management. And that's where, and that was a lot around measures development. So when we went through the Restructuring and Reform Act back in 1998, a long time ago now, 20 plus years, right? We had to implement an entire new measurement system for the IRS. I had the opportunity to support the team that was charged with implementing that, so that's where we implemented the balanced measurement system. So employee sat, customer sat, quality on an equal footing with business results, and then implementing that new measurement system, monitoring, reporting, and then the last position I had before stepping into the CRO role was, in the large business and international division, overseeing our process for identifying compliance risk and the selection of returns for audit. So that was a very specific type of risk assessment, but I think that skill set actually, translated well in being able to apply some of those same types of skills and techniques to a broader identification and view and management of top risk facing the IRS.
Right. Well, thank you very much, and please join me in thanking Tom for a great presentation. One last housekeeping item for those of you who are interested in the detail on Tom's slides. They will be available online within 24 hours if they're not there already. And I'm sure that Tom would be happy to chat with you after the event or perhaps subsequently, depending on your schedules and his schedules. He's a very accessible guy, and thank you, Tom.
Thank you again. Appreciate it.
Good job, Tom.
I just wanted to say, I want to thank you for that, but even further, that was personally very valuable. So, I mean, I go to a lot of hearings stuff, and I walk out wondering, okay, well, it was nice to hear. This was really good.
I appreciate that. Well, let's get on the other chat.